What's up, everybody? My name is Alan Kett. Welcome to the Art of Hip Hop's monthly talks. The Art of Hip Hop is a space dedicated to the creatives behind the scenes in hip hop culture, the artists, the photographers, the creative directors, the graphic designers, the videographers, the filmmakers that have given us the look and feel of hip hop since the beginning. And today we are very excited to bring together a talk with these two gentlemen who I will present. First, we have Michael Zaystev. Michael Zaystev is a leading cannabis industry educator, author, and entrepreneur. He is the founder of High New York, one of the world's largest cannabis industry education and networking groups. His popular events have educated thousands of people both within and outside of the industry on various cannabis-related topics. Foundation Innovation Corp's entrepreneurship training program, and he's the mentor for Founder Institute, the world's largest pre-seed startup accelerator. He's also the academic director, business of cannabis at LIM College in New York City. Michael, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And we also have Fred Brathwaite, aka Fab Five Freddy, a hip-hop cultural icon who emerged in the late 1970s as a graffiti artist who, along with his friends, Lee Quinones, Future 2000, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and many others, became key players in New York 1980s downtown cultural scene. Basically, they brought this, not just downtown, worldwide. He was born in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and he is responsible for really the merging of popular culture. First off with his Blondie's 1980 pop hit Rapture. He went on to co-produce and star in the iconic cult classic film Wild Style, and then went on to be a film director and video director, shooting videos for Nas, Queen Latifah, and many others. I think Shabba ranks as well. And in the late 80s, in the mid 90s, he hosted Yo MTV Raps. Most recently, he has turned his eye on film directing, and in 2019, he released Grass is Greener, which examines the history of cannabis, music, and criminal justice in America. And today, he has now launched a brand, a social equity cannabis brand called Be Noble, which is now available in 10 states. Fab, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for the introduction, and great to be here.
I will let you guys take it away.
Awesome.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you so
also
much.
a major part of the graffiti hip hop scene, doing incredible things in Miami, my man Kat. Great to see you. Great to be here. Let's get it on.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Fab, first of all, I just have to say it's an honor to even have a conversation with you and to be able to dig into this topic. I have to admit, before I was a professional cannabis nerd and a cannabis educator, I fell in love with hip hop way before I even knew what cannabis was. You know, I probably even learned about it from hip hop. So, you know, it's just an honor to be speaking with you. And, you know, to kick off, I want to ask you about your personal journey with cannabis, and two parts to that. One, you know, if you're willing to share about, you know, your relationship with the plant and kind of how that started, that I love hearing those origin stories. And then also, you know, how did you get into the industry? How did you decide to get involved and make that shift? What inspired that part of your creative journey? So two questions I'm hoping you could share.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it all starts for me, and I touch on this in the film I made several years ago called Grass is Greener, which is a documentary that Kat mentioned in the introduction. It's a documentary on the history of cannabis in America, its connection to America's music, and the criminal justice ramifications. And, you know, for me, my dad was a jazz aficionado. He was an accountant, but he was a cannabis user. So growing up in the house, my dad and his friends smoked cannabis. Little curious kid, was aware that my dad would roll up his own cigarettes. And so that was my early experience, seeing my dad smoke. When I became a teenager, I dipped my feet into the cannabis waters, if you will, of smoking, and enjoyed it. So that's kind of how it all began for me. It was very organic. It was in the household. I recall when my mom got wind, I'm a young teen. She was kind of upset because cannabis was criminalized. It still is in many instances around the country. And so she was like, listen, if you're going to smoke this stuff, you better do it in the house. Is I remember a kind of an interesting turning point as a young teen. She got wind that I was smoking weed. So that was it. But at the same time, as a young teen growing up, I grew up with the development of what we know of as hip hop culture, the various aspects of it, graffiti, sticking my feet in those waters early on. So it was kind of all a very harmonious, linked development of the culture that I became a part of, and the culture around cannabis.
Awesome. And I want to mention, since well, we'll get back to the film later, but I do want you to know that in our classes, in our undergrad program at LIM College, in our Business of Cannabis degree program, we have our students watching Grass is Greener in our corporate and social responsibility class. So I want you to know that that's required viewing in our program. So thank you for making that educational and really illuminating film. And we'll certainly get back to that. But I want to ask you about getting into the industry and how that came about, or even, I guess, since we're on the topic of the film, what even inspired you to pursue that project?
Good question. So it grew, first of all, like my dad was like an intellectual. He was passionate about social justice. My dad was passionate about where we were as a people. My dad was very active. He was in the room when Malcolm X was assassinated. And he also was at Martin Luther King's March on Washington. He was with one of those intelligent folks that was looking for answers. My grandfather, my dad's dad, who I never met, he was passed away long before I was born, was a Garveyite. So in learning and knowing about these people and people that had those kind of concerns, that's a reflection of the world I grew up in. Yet my dad they were kind of hip. His jazz friends were always around. So they talked everything from music into politics and what was going on with us as a people. As a young kid, there were copies of High Times around in the house. So learning more as I grew up that this plant is basically harmless, but it was criminalized and it was something you had to sneak about. You couldn't just openly engage in this plant that, by the way, I like to point out, has killed absolutely no one. So that was a bit of the culture. So I was very aware of the plant as a kid growing up, very aware of its connection to music. I guess one of the things I illustrate in the film was, as a teenager, I discovered a record I was shopping at a place that used to, record stores for the most part don't exist, but it was a well-known record store in New York called J&R Music World. Happened to be flipping through the jazz racks, and there's this record called, I think it was 15 Reefer Songs, which I'm like, what? Reefer Songs? And there's big names like, Cab Calloway and Fats Waller and different jazz musicians that my dad played jazz all the time. I brought this album, went home. My dad and his friends were all in the house. I was like, man, what is going on with these songs and this music and songs about the plant? So that was a spark early on in life growing up. And basically, I'm setting all this up it was about 2016, 2015, in a conversation with a friend who now is my business partner, who really had been involved in cannabis in the legacy world, the underground world, if you will, in California. He was a brother, and he'd been involved in every aspect of the plant, growing cannabis up in Humboldt, moving it to different places around, supplying people that plant. He wanted to get involved in it as a legal business, but being that he had been a victim of the system, he had a conviction that didn't allow him. It's sad when you think about the way laws have been put together around this plant. Those that have pioneered it as a business and have come into the, have been criminalized and prosecuted, are often in most states not allowed to participate in this now growing multi-billion-dollar business that they help pioneer, if you will. Anyway, he had an idea to create a consultancy. He said, we were talking one day, he said, man, I got an idea. Because I have a federal conviction, I can't touch the plant, but my idea is to create a consultancy company, and I plan to call it 40 Acres and a Greenhouse, which was a reference to the 40 acres and a mule that those former slaves had been promised after the Civil War ended and Reconstruction began under Abraham Lincoln. This is Spike Lee calls his production company 40 Acres and a Mule. And this is a really important part of American history that had it had been enacted, there would have been a considerable amount of wealth developed for African peoples who had been enslaved and kidnapped and enslaved in this country. But that was granted, but it was taken away. In that conversation, we were going back and forth. Yo, that's a dope idea. Oh, by the way, I'm telling my man, we were involved in this plant from the beginning, promoting it, in effect, marketing it with the various songs that were made. This is one of America's greatest achievements, is the development of America's music, which resonates around the world. And the fact that cannabis was integral with the key creators, I felt was a fascinating story. Those were primarily people of African descent. Then I thought of every other musical genre. Cannabis has been significant. We were the key creators, all the way up to hip hop, which I helped expose to mainstream America and the rest of the world via hosting Your MTV Raps. And a lot of these artists, Snoop Dogg, Cypress Hill, Method Man, Redman, had their first national television debut was on my show. I was like, what a great way to tell the story of cannabis through looking at all these musical links that have been foundation of America's music, but to look at the criminal justice and the racism that led to cannabis being criminalized in 1937. I said, all in this one phone conversation, I knew this was a dope idea. It would be a cool way to tell the story. I was like, I'm gonna call it Grass is Greener. We going back on the phone, yeah, he, ha, ha. And it all came together like that in one phone conversation. I went right to work, putting together the outline, the idea of making this film, which would be, once again, Grass is Greener. Netflix said, we like this idea, we'd like to work with you. And I rolled up the sleeves and went right to work. So that's the story of how I made the film. And I guess in looking at the criminal justice aspects of how Black people, brown people, a lot of the hip and cool people supporting the music and in the culture and the counterculture as well, have been targeted by the government forces that criminalize, once again, this plant, cannabis, that has killed no one. Us that are really close to the plant, we don't even use the word marijuana anymore when you learn that this was a word that was given to this plant to make it sound more Mexican, because the initial targets of cannabis criminalization in America were the Mexican people that were living in states, close to Mexico, or that was a part of their they enjoyed using the plant. And a lot of African-American people, particularly in places that were developing jazz music, and the musicians were traveling, hipping people to this great stimulant. So that began the focus, and it was a very racist, focused attack on the plant. A lot of lies, like you'll be criminally insane, you'll become a mad rapist, lunatic, mass murderer if you smoke this plant. Was a huge campaign that was government-backed, government-funded. It was led by a man by the name of Harry Anslinger, sort of a J. Edgar Hoover, mini-me type of guy that really campaigned relentlessly. And he was successful in convincing people that cannabis is going to make you crazy. And there was a lot of racist and racial undertones as well, in who he targeted, why he targeted, once again, focusing on folks of color and folks creating America's culture, music, and whatever. And seeing all these things and looking at the criminality, looking at Black folks had disproportionately been criminalized up until today, if you will. We smoke, white folks who smoke just as much weed as Black folks were not the targets of the criminal justice system. And so looking at all this and laying it all out in Grass is Greener inspired me to create a brand to raise awareness about these injustices. And that chose to focus on a brother from Louisiana that had been given a 13-year prison sentence for 2 joints worth of cannabis. He was in prison. His case was had become a celebrated case of activists raising awareness. His case so glaringly showed how wrong and unjust these draconian laws have been, the way to keep bodies, oftentimes Black and brown bodies, in the prison system, making money off of them. And this guy had been in prison for 7 years when I'm in Louisiana, in New Orleans, interviewing his mother, his sisters. It got really emotional. When you watch the film Grass is Greener, you'll see this scene, have your tissues ready. And luckily, in the course of making the movie, Bernard Noble got a parole. And we flew back to Louisiana to film him walk out of prison into his family's arms. It's the first time I met him. It's actually on film. It's in the movie. And I was really moved. And I mean, I want to do something. And what I did became the brand Grass is Greener. That was kind of long, but I hope
No, that's awesome. I really appreciate that. And I want to just reflect on some of what I heard, which is, I'm going to start with, in cannabis, genetics matter, lineage matters. And I'm hearing that even for you, like your father, your grandfather, they were kind of on this cutting edge of culture and had this creativity and curiosity. And it's interesting to know your story, that you've been at the forefront of hip hop, helping bring it to the mainstream. And now with this film, Grass is Greener, with the Be Noble brand, you're doing the same thing or a similar thing in cannabis. And so that's an interesting thing. But then I want to dig into, and of course, this is all in the film, and I highly recommend everyone watch this movie if you're interested in this incredible history. But it starts way before hip hop with jazz, and you mentioned it, and it was this interesting thing where and this is something I go through with all my students when we go through the history of prohibition. It had nothing to do with cannabis. Most of it was all about the people that were consuming it, and really it was just an excuse to target these people, and it was all really a vehicle for racism and had nothing to do with the plant. And in fact, they ignored all the science about, hey, this is medicine, because as a lot of people don't know, cannabis was medicine and was in every American medical cabinet in every household before it became demonized and illegal. And one of the things that I think is super interesting is, one of the biggest threats to the establishment and the government and the Anslingers of the world was at these jazz clubs. You would have people of all races, people of all backgrounds coming together around the music, around the cannabis, and seeing, hey, we could get along just fine. We're not that different. We could share this beautiful thing. It doesn't matter what you look like, where you come from. It all works for, it's universal. And they really didn't like that. That was really threatening and scary. And so, of course, it led to this war on drugs and all of these terrible outcomes for, as you alluded to, Black and brown people were arrested 5 to 10 times more than white people, even though consumption was pretty much exactly the same. And so it's pretty obvious that this was no accident. right? And this was intentional, and these policies and policing were really harmful to specific communities, and that was by design, right? It's really hard. Once you learn the history, once you see the statistics, it's pretty much impossible to argue.
Yeah.
And so, I think first of all, it's incredibly important to bring that into the light, especially as we're in the midst of this cannabis becoming mainstream, right? It's gone from, and I want to ask you about this because, hip hop, we just celebrated the 50-year anniversary not too long ago. And, you know, uh, from what I understand, back in the day, this was counterculture, right? You mentioned, obviously, you came up through graffiti and all these other things that were back then were not nearly as celebrated as they are today. We didn't have, let alone museums for any of this stuff or anything like that. And, I feel like cannabis is on that trajectory now where
True.
it wasn't too long ago where this was a scary, bad thing. And now it's becoming more and more normal, more and more mainstream. And, we're not close to 50 years into legalization, but I'm curious to hear from you. Um, what do you think that looks like, that progression? How is it going to be similar to maybe hip hop, where it went from not only counterculture to mainstream, but to driving culture and to being the thing that everyone copied and inspired all this other stuff and drove culture. And now we have cannabis that could potentially be following a very similar path. So I'm curious how you view that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I look at the similarities all the time now with a developing cannabis brand, a business. And the way we're looking to market and promote, we're following some of, if not a lot of the playbook of how hip hop music developed itself as a business, with, once again, people from the culture jumping in to make significant moves to steer it as a business, those that know, like, and have a passion and a feel for what to do and how to do it, how to communicate with this audience in the right way. In the beginning, with hip hop music, there were records that were coming out that were going gold, selling tens of thousands of copies, no marketing, no promotion. And the labels weren't giving it much thought, except they were liking the fact that the business was performing, but they were not really embracing it with any love and realizing that something revolutionary was afoot. But me just having, and a lot of this came from the people I grew up around, my dad and his very hip jazz loving friends. I would remember hearing them talk about the frustrations that they had, how they wanted to have their own labels and control their business, but they just, the racism that still existed then. I mean, these guys couldn't even go to the South and feel safe because they had racists on their backs. They had to be very aware and cautious where they moved and like how they moved, just to be the creatives that they were. And so as I've gotten older, I constantly think back to things that have inspired me and motivated me to make the moves I made. And a lot of it had to do with the hip sophistication and frustration of a lot of the guys in my dad's era. And so I had a vision and an idea that what we were doing, kids in the street writing their names, making paintings, DJs, rappers, break dancers. I felt I had an idea, if I can put this all together and just display it as one interrelated thing, which it actually wasn't at the time in the streets. If I could show it as one thing and make the connections, it would inspire folks, but also get people to look at us in a better light, because young Black and Latin folks, for me, if you were wearing streetwear at that time, before streetwear was a business or a thing, you were always depicted in the media, New York media primarily, where I live, in a very negative light, like a robbery, a mugging, these animals in the ghettos, look at them. And it was almost always us. And I realized we a lot more than that. And I kind of came up with the ideas that became Wild Style to put us in a better light, to show that we are creative, because there was nothing positive about graffiti painting. Rap music was barely a blip on the map, but I felt like showing who we are could put a face. And it was a mixed scene, as what people try to paint us all as Black and Latin, but there were white kids down with us, Asian kids, you know. And so that was the motivation for what became Wild Style. It's the gift that keeps giving, because we were making a movie for the homies in New York, in the hood, and our arty friends downtown, which I was connected to as a visual artist, hooking up with Charlie Ahern, who was embedded in that downtown underground film scene. He totally got it. We became like a team collaborating to bring this vision, which became Wild Style, to the audience. Plus, there are a couple of scenes in Wild Style where we're smoking a little chiba. And I'd like to also add that one of the early breakbeat records, one of the foundation music of hip hop, there was a record by a group called the Harlem Underground Band. And this was a record that DJs would cut up and mix back and forth, just this one part of the record in the beginning. And the guy said, "Hey, man, what's happening? I got that good chiba chiba, right on, right on, right on, right on." If you can go on YouTube and pull that up and listen. I remember like that was one of the slang terms for the plant back then, chiba. There's been, in fact, at one point in Wild Style, I asked people to tell us the names that they've used or heard used for the plant. The names are long. I like to use reefer, which is very old school. And there's been different names, Bud, the Chronic, long list. But Chiba Chiba was kind of not just a strain. It initially was really high quality cannabis. And that was something embedded in my mind at the very beginnings of the development of hip hop. And so I'm saying all that to say was, yeah, man, the film went beyond expectations. It's become the first look many people have that this is a complete culture, and it inspired people around the planet. I'm so proud to say. But yeah, looking at what we're doing with cannabis and Be Noble as a business, and looking at other brands developing, especially what Cookies and Burner has done, he's using that same hip hop ethos of aggressive, like hand-to-hand marketing, getting into the men. Burner, a lot of people don't know, he's made like over 30 complete albums, where, you know, he raps like, "Hey, I'm that guy with the grow, and I got 1,000 lights coming with these different strains of cannabis and stuff." So he's used that hustle that he's learned from hip hop to create probably the most recognizable brand in cannabis right now. And what cannabis is going to need going forward is a lot more brands, and that's what Be Noble has been doing. Like, we're a brand, we give back 10% of our revenue in the states we're in, to organizations helping people that have been victimized. Bernard Noble is living well now, I'm happy to say. So the story of the brand is, here's what we did to help change this dynamic, which is imprisoned and criminalized too many people. And on top of that, and most importantly, we're providing fire flower. We're now developed a working relationship with Mario Sherbinski Guzman, who I equate to the great producers and DJs in hip hop. He's responsible genetically for engineering the gelato series of strains of cannabis. If you look up Mario Sherbinski, it's a Latin brother from out west who was tight with Burner and Cookies in the beginning, helping hook up some of the strains that made Cookies what it is. But he's now working with Be Noble, who we've also recently expanded into Europe, which is amazing. And so he's going to be bringing genetics out of his archive, if you will, as along with the other greatest hits, if you look up strains developed by Mario Shabinsky, there are many, and many of the dopest strains out there are blended with strains that he's come up with. This is a developing part of cannabis now, the kind of connoisseurship of getting various flavors and terpene profiles and different levels of sativas and indicas together in something that's equivalent to the way fine wines are produced. And Mario Shabinsky is one of those guys that we're proud to be working with right now.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Shout out to Stravinsky and, just the growers, the breeders, they don't get enough credit. Those are the guys
Yes,
who,
we're looking to tell their stories.
yeah,
Yes.
without them, there is no, there's no product, there's no nothing. And, it's not easy work. It's a labor of love. But
If I could just add a little
please.
footnote to what you're saying. When I was coming up in the early days as a young teen smoking, all cannabis that I got had seeds in it. That was a normal thing. So the first thing you do is you'd get a $5 or $10 bag, of weed. You chip in, the homies, that classic record by the Loonies. I got 5 on it. Like let's chip in and like get us a sack. Oftentimes when I was coming up, first thing you had to do was bust that bag open, pull out an album. It's hard to find an album right now, like a record album on newspaper. You clean out the seeds. So when you smoke, the seed wouldn't pop and drop and burn holes in your clothes. This is real live weed head stuff. And so the thing is, the geneticists have understood and figured out how to manipulate the cannabis plant to the point where smokers today, especially younger smokers, have never seen a cannabis seed because the female plant is all that's used. So that female does not devote its plant energy to developing seeds. It develops its plant energy to producing that THC, that special ingredient, that rosin that really sends you there. And it's a very specific science involved. I mean, I saw a cannabis seed recently and I was like, I had to stop and be like, it's been like a whole bunch of years since I've really seen a seed. But I was over at Cannabis, which is the big European cannabis business gathering, and I met this one company they call Sensi Seeds. They were a legendary Dutch company, and Shabinsky was with us, and they have an arrangement to sell Shabinsky seeds and seeds from several other geneticist producers, because that's what you go to buy if you want to buy that flower. You got to, I got seeds for gelato, for the different other strains he's responsible for. So that's a big part of the cannabis business as well, like kind of behind the scenes, the geneticists, who I equate to dope DJs and producers that have made hip hop music, beats, the legacies that we are so involved with and listen to.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to mention one thing that I think is really important, which is, and you alluded to it when you were talking about the history of prohibition, but the tools that were used to vilify and demonize the plant and to have all these terrible outcomes for society, my belief it was primarily media where they were lying in the newspapers and making all these propaganda films like Reefer Madness and all this other stuff. And also, and once they influenced public opinion through policy, they would kind of codify all of this, bad laws that allowed them to abuse the power and to target people. And so, I think what you've done, what I heard when you talked about Wild Style and even what you did with Grass is Greener, you're kind of using that tool of media to tell the truth and to give the positive story, as opposed to, we had decades of propaganda of, just say no, cannabis will make you violent or dumb or whatever, all of these nonsense stories. And you're taking that same tool and applying it in a positive way to give people the truth and also the inspiration to say, hey, if you're a part of this culture, that's okay. That's actually a beautiful thing. You're not alone, and you can embrace it and you could pursue it, and there's opportunity for you. And I think the second thing is, I tell my students that you have to pursue the policy solutions too, because although legalization is happening,
Mhm.
it's still far from a done deal. And I
Mhm.
love that you mentioned Cannabis and that you've taken the brand to Europe and abroad, because while we're somewhat far along in legalization in the US, this
Mhm.
is going to be a global thing. And we're still in the very early stages of global legalization. And so there's still a lot of need for people to really be educated and understand the policy makes a big difference. And it's not enough to just pass a law and say, oh, cannabis is legal. The devil is in the details. And we need
Mhm.
to make sure that those laws are equitable and actually work and
Mhm.
actually encourage access, safe access, quality access, affordable access, and that you know there's restorative justice where because there's still people who are in prison today for cannabis crimes, even though legalization is happening and there's legal business happening, taxes being collected, and all that stuff, there's still people who are facing the collateral consequences of bad policy from years ago. So,
Yeah.
um, that being said, I wanted to ask you because you mentioned one of my favorite albums of all time, The Chronic, and this was in my mind, a great example of hip hop influencing cannabis culture,
Yeah.
where, they called that album The Chronic. And then after that, everyone was looking for the Chronic. They wanted the Chronic.
Ah.
And so I'm curious if there's other examples that stand out in your mind and you mentioned Burner, of course, examples of hip hop really influencing cannabis culture. And then on the other side, because now we're seeing the Snoop Dogs of the world, the Wiz Khalifa's, Currency, and a lot of these MCs who came up rapping about weed and weed culture, they're now getting into the business. They're now getting legal brands going and they're using, their music as a vehicle to promote and build brands. So I'm
Yeah.
just curious, what stands out to you as some moments of cultural significance there?
Well, gosh, there have been numerous. I mean, first of all, there's been a back and forth from cannabis basically has aided. I won't say it creates the creative in you, but if you've got creative in you, it'll put you in a zone where it can flow out of you in maybe a more effortless way, somewhat, depending on who you are as an artist. I think that's why so many jazz musicians going back loved cannabis because I think it aided the improvisational process. And there's people that speak to this in the film Grass is Greener. I think the fact that one of the early hotbeds of cannabis use, which I kind of looked at this in the film Grass is Greener, is New Orleans in Louisiana is the birthplace of jazz. So you have Louis Armstrong and dozens of other incredible musicians making this amazing music, jazz, with this improvisational as opposed to this rigid thing. They were able to flow in and out of the structure of the song. Once again, that's the genius of America's music, jazz, and cannabis aided that process. And I think that's why the musicians found they can get in a zone where they can be even more creative by the state cannabis puts them in. As opposed to getting drunk and plastered on alcohol, you most likely won't be able to finger and do all those things as precisely as you can do. So it was an unwritten maybe unspoken sensibility that people just knew. Like, I feel better. I'm in a zone when I'm on this plant that has aided the creative process from the beginnings of jazz into hip hop. There's been a back and forth. And then you have um, uh, people that make hip hop, have been big proponents just mentioning smoking, mentioning blunts, all the different hip terms that developed for the plant, as rap spread out to various regions, it became a big thing to basically talk about, because hip hop, as it's created musically, are artists talking to each other as well as talking to their audiences. And then me being at the cusp of that early on was able to like learn the different ways different people from different places in the country speak to the plant, reference the plant. Chronic is a great example of a new name for the plant that just fits so perfectly. But what was really remarkable for me, once again, Grass is Green. I love talking about the film because, and I directed Snoop's first music video, What's My Name? I turned Snoop and the Dog Pound into dogs. So I was very close with that camp at that time, and was, hey, Snoop, where's that chronic? And he would, remember, the particular strain, I can't remember what the specific strain was, but it had these bright orange hairs on the plant that I was like, oh, that's it? Oh, oh yeah, that's it. But in Grass is Greener, Snoop tells the story, which I didn't know, that he, and I spent a lot of time around Dre at the time. I know Dre wasn't really a smoker. He would occasionally hit a little chocolate tie, which is a kind of an indica kind of heavy strain that hasn't been around in a long time. So I remember he would tell me he'd like to puff on some tie, but Snoop and the other members of the Dog Pound, Daz, Corrupt, whatever, C-Style, they was puffing all the time, and I was right in there with them. But Snoop tells the story in Grass is Greener how he told Dre, listen, the hottest thing on the street is the chronic. That's the hottest weed. That's the new term for the killer weed. This record is going to be the shit. You need to call your record the Chronic. And the other thing that we do in the film, which I also didn't realize, the album cover, The Chronic, is inspired by the image of zigzag rolling papers, which is the popular rolling paper out west. Like in New York, we grew up, we had Bamboo and Easy Wider and all these other things that were the old school rolling papers. In different regions of the country have different types of papers. And so that's kind of a big part of the origin story of the Chronic, Snoop's influence, and Dre listening to the team around him. I learned a lot about how Dre works. You know, there were over 40 records made for the Chronic, and that team around Dre at that time helped them pick what became that very important album in hip hop. So I had a close-up view of that process. That video took that entire summer to finish, because the first day of shooting, that turned into a near riot. And Dre said, listen, Fab, if you stay out here with me, we'll get the video finished, but my main priority is finishing Snoop's album. So I ended up spending like practically 2 months that summer in the early 90s and saw the process, smoked a lot of Chronic with the crew. And I think also another thing I'd like to point out, which was kind of connecting to the question of hip hop influencing cannabis and cannabis influencing hip hop. Steve Hager, that was a longtime editor of High Times magazine in the 90s, got wind of, as hip hop was rising, Yo MTV Rap spreading, dominating music around the world, that some prominent people in hip hop were big cannabis smokers. So Steve Hager began to put the biggest guys on the cover of High Times. And that was Snoop, Redman, Method Man, Be Real from Cypress Hill, and other cats that were, it helped to further solidify that connection, which has just been the back and forth culturally between the most listened to music and that magical cannabis plant. It's been a connection between culture and cannabis for a very long time.
Wow, that is incredible. That story of, I can't imagine being around there, being around that album and that creative process and that time. That's just like, that's a movie right there.
Yeah, that was special. It was special. In fact, when you see Grass is Greener, some of the photos when Snoop is telling the story, these were still photos that I took of Snoop and Dre in the studio when Snoop is telling that that story about how he told Dre, you need to call your album the Chronic and da da da. It's illustrated with photos that I took at that time because I was always taking pictures, you know, making little videos leading up to the music video that I made where I, once again, I turned Snoop into a dog. Bow, wow, wow.
That's incredible. That's amazing. So, Fab, I want to ask you, I want to shift gears a sec and
Sure.
ask you about, sticking with the topic of culture. Um, I want to ask you about fashion, and ask you about this because LIM College primarily was focused on the business of fashion before we
Yes.
launched this cannabis program. And
Ah,
and so I'm far from the fashion guy. I'm the cannabis guy, even though I got my Biggie Smalls t-shirt on right now. But
okay, that's what's up. You're looking fly over there.
I
Okay. Oh,
appreciate, I'm a kid from Brooklyn. So
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
I want to ask you about, you know, it's the term that comes to mind for me is lifestyle, right? Because now a lot of, especially in business, they all talk about, the different lifestyle and consumers and kind of marketing to different audiences, all that stuff. And now that, cannabis, just like hip hop, has become seen as a lifestyle.
Mm,
And one of the primary ways people express their lifestyle is through their fashion, through their clothing. And so,
sure.
and you also mentioned Burner and Cookies, who in my mind is like one of the best examples of, you know, the overlap of cannabis, hip hop, and fashion, because they sell a ton of cookies, clothing, and he has cookies, clothing stores, and all this stuff. So I just want to ask you, as a multifaceted creative, as a visual artist, where do you see fashion? How do you see the kind of overlap between these three seemingly disconnected industries: hip hop, cannabis, and fashion?
Yeah, well, a lot of youth culture now and in previous eras has always flirted with a counterculture, if you will. And cannabis being a part of the counterculture, particularly in the 60s, rock and roll, anti-war, um, you know, all the students and people taking it to the streets fighting for their rights. Um, they would message on the t-shirts. That began the beginning of a culture of putting the message on your shirt, on your front, on your back. And that cannabis leaf became a ubiquitous image, a part of the iconography of that time. And so that was, I guess, the first connection, hip hop, no, not hip hop, cannabis and fashion, if you will, at that time. And I think, Berner did something really clever with the development of the brand cookies, which initially grew from a strain called Girl Scout cookies. And then, of course, the Girl Scouts of America was like, oh, no, no, no. So they dropped the Girl Scout and it was just cookies. And what was so cool about cookies, when you think about it, we know if we see the cookies logo, we know like wink, wink, that means good weed. That guy's in the weed game. But if you're not hip, then you just think cookies, like chocolate chip or whatever kind of cookies you like. So it's a kind of a real coded way and a real connecting to the counterculture way of young kids and their parents letting them wear this without really knowing, hey, that's really about this weed brand that's really popular. So, and then the fact that Berner has built a brand where he uses the merchandising, the hoodie, the t-shirt and branded items to appeal to the same type of an audience that would want to wear a Supreme or whatever that hot urban streetwear brand is, Billionaire Boys Club or whatever that may be of the moment that appeals to a hip, cutting edge teen or whatever. It is a thing that is a part, and once again, it's a thing that we're looking at as well for Be Noble. You can go on our website, be-noble.com, and look at the Be Noble story, but I also put up some images of merch that we have in development coming. It'll initially just be our brand logo, but then we've got some people on our team that are super dialed in to cutting edge urban fashion globally, which is everything so kind of global now. And so we're going to be doing some interesting things as well to get our brand message out, as well as music playlists. We've got Be Noble playlists now going up on Spotify, Apple Music. We're going to be having DJ sessions under the Be Noble logo on YouTube with some of the world's hottest DJs. So once again, we're going to be making the cultural connections that have been a part of cannabis in America from the origin. Once again, linked with America's music, jazz, all the way to hip hop, not to leave out reggae and even R&B. Like, you know, when D'Angelo's song Brown Sugar, that's really a song, very clever song about cannabis. You know, Rick James's song Mary Jane, that's a clever song about cannabis, you know, that we may not have known about. You know, George Clinton, the great genius architect of Parliament Funkadelic, was not just into cannabis, he was into psychedelics and did them all quite frequently during the 70s funk heyday. And that was a dream to get him in my film. I was going to interview him in front of the mothership at the Black Smithsonian in DC to get him to tell me some of them stories of back in the days, but we didn't make that happen. But that's still an interview I plan to do and use that as some of the developing Be Noble content. These are some of the things that we have on the drawing board that we're about to kick into, stories and people sharing historic moments, musical moments like them. They're going to be like noble stories, actually. So that's something that we'll be rolling out soon. So I know I give long answers. I hope I answered your question.
That's awesome. I appreciate the insight and the depth you're providing. And I got maybe one or two more questions for you. And then one, I'm curious what advice you have for aspiring cannabis entrepreneurs or people who want to get into the industry
Right.
and maybe even aspiring artists and creatives, because you know in my judgment it's not so different being an entrepreneur and a creative or an artist. But I'm curious from your experience, given that you've succeeded in a whole variety of mediums and ventures, like what advice would you give someone who's either getting started or just trying to get started?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, the thing that I do with any of the things that I get into, I do a deep dive and I go down that rabbit hole. In this era, it's so much easier to do because we have this device that we're talking to each other with. Even the one in our pockets, man, is crazy. That's the research for Grassroots Greener started with me Googling stuff and pulling up clips on YouTube. It's like so many clips, music, all the jazz reefer songs. If you just search jazz reefer songs, a whole bunch of playlists will come up on YouTube. But once again, read, learn, study, get an understanding of what's happening. Like I said, it's super easy. I like to say it's all a few clicks away. When my generation, and I'm luckily that I was into the library, I would gladly go to wherever I could to get the books, but it was more of a tedious process as opposed to clicking, reading, making notes. So there's a hell of a lot of info out there. Study up. There's a lot of developing business components of cannabis connected closely to the plant. And then there's developing businesses around the plant. You know, Snoop's has an investment entity you guys may not know about called Casa Verde. It's literally like a venture capitalist investment arm where Snoop, they don't invest in things that are what we refer to as plant touching. But in states that have legal cannabis, there's many other components that are business related, like the different softwares and innovations that are created so that the cannabis businesses and dispensaries and things that are developed to aid in growing, and lights and different types of technologies that are shifting. So there's a lot of different aspects of how to get involved in the business, which is important to understand because cannabis is still federally illegal in America. The more than 30 states that have legal cannabis, medical or adult use, all have a certain set of rules and regulations that you must have an understanding of if you're in a particular state, like Florida, like Illinois, like California. You really want to know, well, how does it work in this state and what are the opportunities? So you got to go down that rabbit hole and do a deep dive, see what you feel is passionate for you, and then figure out how to attack it and get involved. I mean, it's a maze of varying regulations, rules, and stipulations. So the blessing that I'm learning probably more about this than the usual person, because the Be Noble brand, we made a licensing arrangement. We own the company, but we have a licensing arrangement with Curaleaf, the biggest cannabis company in the world. They're in most states in America, and in the different states that our brand is in, there's different compliance regulations, different rules. Like, for instance, Florida is a huge state for cannabis with a very big medical cannabis business. But Florida, every product sold in the stores has to be white packaging, black lettering. No, like the development of the Be Noble brand, our color, the colors that we use, like red, primarily, whatever. You can put up the actual product as a display, but what the consumer leaves out of the store with is white packaging and black lettering. I was shocked that's every single cannabis product sold in dispensaries throughout the state. That's what the Florida consumer deals with. And so you have non-cannabis users, these legislators, thinking, well, I'm going to come up with the rules for cannabis. And I'm like, why would you come up with that? Anyway, this is the different things that we deal with from state to state. It's a different set of rules and regulations that if you're in those states, you've got to understand, like, okay, here's what I can and can't do in Maryland, in Massachusetts, in Florida, New York, etc. So it's a bit to figure out, but if you're passionate about the plant, dive in. It's still the early days of this developing as a business. Even though there are some huge entities out there, it's still just the beginning, is also something to keep in mind. So it's a lot more figuring out to do.
Absolutely. And so I'm gonna make my shameless plug right now, which is if you want to learn more about this, the beautiful thing is back in the day, this was a scary thing to learn about.
Oh,
And now
so
we're very fortunate. We have a lot of resources. So I'm going to share two. One, if you want to pick up a book and just dip a toe, I got, you can't really see it, my book, the Cannabis Business Book, which
okay.
you could pick that up on Amazon. I interviewed almost 100 cannabis industry leaders and got their wisdom and insights. So
That's your book? Oh,
that's my book.
Oh boy, I need a signed copy, baby.
I got you, no problem.
Thank you.
Consider it done. And then
Thank you.
if you want a deep dive, now you could go and get a degree in the business of cannabis, both a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And you could come to campus in Midtown at LIM College, or you could do it fully online from anywhere in the world.
Wow.
Learn from industry leaders, business owners, and people who have been doing it day in, day out for years and years and years, real experts. So find out more at limcollege.edu.
Very cool.
That's my shameless plug. I had to do it. But
please, not shameless. We need all that information. That's great. I know Medgar Evers College is trying to do something. If they're not, I spoke to some people there and I thought that was great. And this is brilliant to see it at the collegiate level. People can come in and learn, and all that work that real kind of scholars do to teach people. That's wow.
Yeah,
special.
and that they're doing it actually, and I'm extremely proud to say I taught the first cannabis class over there when they first launched their program. So shout out to them as well for spreading cannabis education. And so Fab, I want to wrap with, you just said, which I agree with you, we're still in the early days here in the
Yeah,
grand scheme of things.
yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could share with us, how do you see the cannabis industry, cannabis culture evolving in the next, I don't know, 10, 20, maybe even 50 years? What does that
Wow.
look like from now? Yeah. And
Well,
and, and where does hip hop fit into that, if anywhere?
yeah, once again, people in hip hop generally love cannabis. It's been a mainstay as since the beginning of hip hop, so I think it'll still be there. Some of the other substances that have been rapped about and kind of popularized on some rap records, I don't think it's too good. Some of the people drinking lean, which is basically cough syrup, basically getting strung out on opioids, like the same thing as heroin, is not good. Some of these pills and Percocets and all that shit, and it ain't good for you. So you go too hard with that, you're gonna end up in a really bad place. Cannabis, once again, man, medically so important, so beneficial. The more we learn as we're doing now, we can now, even if you don't want to smoke to kind of get high and you've got aches and pains and medical issues, if you've got cannabis available in your state, you can learn what strains of cannabis can help those aches and pains, as opposed to doctors prescribing you opioids, getting you strung out, hooked, and your life upside down. That doesn't happen when you can find the right cannabis to aid the various issues that it can help you with. So it's important to basically dial in on that and to just once again know as much as you can. I mean, it's so easy to access this information. Is the point that still is mind-boggling to me, how much you can learn online if you just focus in and go hard, and then get the links and get the books and go to Amazon or wherever you go to order your books so you could develop. It's funny, I remember in the film, once again, Be Real from Cypress Hill, which was probably the first hip hop group to go full on in support of cannabis, talked about reading Jack Herrera's book, The Emperor's New Clothes. Is that the
The
title?
Emperor Wears No Clothes.
Emperor
Yeah,
Wears No
classic
Clothes.
cannabis book. Yep.
Yeah, legendary cannabis book. That's also a very important strain, the Jack Herrera strain. But Be Real in my film talks about what he learned reading that book and how he was like, no, we're going hard for cannabis to big it up, to basically inform and basically educate. And they've got a successful brand. They're still out there touring. So proud to feature those guys on Your MTV Raps back in the days. And yeah, man, it's people are going to learn more. It's cannabis is going to normalize as we go forward in different ways. There's going to still be a lot of surprises. A big thing that could happen, we feel, before this election in November, is cannabis to be rescheduled. The schedule, they literally, cannabis has killed no one. There's medical benefits. They have it on the same level as heroin, which is ridiculous. That needs to be fixed. Biden has talked about uh, this rescheduling, which would really lower the criminalization and hopefully opens up federal bank. It's still problematic because there's banking restrictions, 280E. So companies involved in cannabis can't get all the full tax benefits. So there's still things that are thing. But I think similar to what we have with the legalization of alcohol and the guardrails and frameworks set up is something comparable to what people are looking to have with cannabis. And so as we go forward, when the illicit cannabis shops that are all over New York are shut down, it'll be like the liquor stores, like in the neighborhood, where you can go and buy spirits of your choosing and enjoy them, not abuse them. And I think cannabis will be like that. But I always want to mention, cannabis has killed no one. 100,000 people a year die from alcohol usage every year.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. On top of that, cannabis has saved a lot of lives and helped a lot of people get healthy and feel better and have a higher quality of life.
Yes.
So on that high note, let me thank you, Fab, for
yeah,
not
this
only
was a good
taking the
convo. I
time.
appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the work you've done to bring positivity and culture to the people, both in through hip hop, through cannabis, and everyone check out Grass is Greener, support Be Noble, and keep up with this man because he's clearly a pioneer and doing great stuff and just a good I'm gonna put it out there, creative genius. So thank you, Fab. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and
So
thank
much.
you to the
Appreciate it.
Museum of Hip Hop for putting us together and for
Yeah, my
promoting.
man Alan Kett down. I got to get down there to hang out with him. Thanks, Kett, and all the great work you're doing. I got to get down and hang out, my dude. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Fab. You're welcome
Thanks.
anytime. And for
Thanks for
everybody
the
else that's
intro.
listening to this, please come down, see us in Miami. We're in Wynwood. We're open 7 days a week, and we'd love to have you come down.
Yeah, doing great things down there, man. I appreciate that. All right, everybody, thank you so much. I got to go. I'm out of here.
Peace, everybody.
Peace.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Bye.
Peace.